Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, and today we are talking to Warren Mundine, the highly respected and influential businessman. He's a political strategist and he is a strong advocate for empowering Australia's first people to build a sustained economy and to create business opportunities. He is also the director of the Indigenous Forum at the Centre for Independent Studies. He's a company director. He was president of the Australian Labor Party and a former chair of the government's Indigenous Advisory Council. Well, it's wonderful to have you on the Afternoon Light podcast, Warren, and particularly as we're going to talk today about Robert Menzies and his record on Indigenous affairs. There is a real story to be told here, and one that's probably not, I think, as well known as it should be. And I thought we'd just start off with your thoughts, Warren, on what do you think of Menzies' record on Indigenous affairs? Do you think he gave much time and thought to issues relating to the Indigenous people in Australia?
He did, actually. It's really funny to think about this. I look at the things that Sir Robert Menzies and his cabinet and government did for Aboriginal Australians, Indigenous Australians, and I think to myself, because when I was, in the Labor Party, if it was a Labor Party Prime Minister who did some of these things, we'd have statues and we'd have a day off work and a parade, and we'd have all these amazing things. Because you mentioned the 1962 voting franchise. Until then, under the Constitution, it was states who, if you had voting rights in states, then you could vote in the federal elections. So what you had was New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia having voting rights, but Aboriginals in Queensland and Western Australia didn't, and because they didn't have those rights. So he extended that voting right. And how powerful was that? Because within 10 years we had Senator Neville Bonner within the federal parliament, and we've been progressing ever since then.
Yeah, it's interesting, Warren, the 1962 legislative change, which was so important, it meant that all Aboriginal people living in Western Australia and Queensland, which were the states at the time that had disenfranchised Aboriginal people, they could now vote at Commonwealth elections. I mean, it's unthinkable in this day and age that certain people in Australia, particularly First Nations people, wouldn't be able to vote in elections. But that 1962 legislative change and enfranchisement of so many Aboriginal people in Australia, it's never been given the profile, of course, of the 67 referendum, which is iconic in Australian history and, of course, overwhelmingly supported by the Australian people. Warren, why do you think it took until 1962 to give Aborigines in Australia the vote in federal elections?
By a quirk of history, anyone who was a subject of the Crown, whichever Aboriginals were in New South Wales and Victoria and Tasmania and South Australia, they got voting rights. Now, not to say that a lot did vote, because people on Aboriginal reserves and that didn't so much, but other people did. And I come across documentation in that when I was writing my book. My grandfather enrolled in 1915 and my grandmother to vote. And that was just an amazing thing. So in my family, we've had this long history of voting. But in Queensland and Western Australia, they actually did take the vote away from it. They didn't have the vote. In fact, in legislation in Queensland and Western Australia, they didn't get voting rights until Menzies pushed that rights and almost really shaming them in a lot of sense that they had to have give voting rights to Aboriginal people, and that's what happened. Now it just shows a person like sort of Menzies who was able to take that challenge up and say, this is for all Australians, no matter who they are. All Australians should have, voting rights in Commonwealth elections. Now, he didn't have control of the state, but by that process and by pushing that, it embarrassed Western Australia. So Western Australia and Queensland changed their voting laws, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in those states got the voting right. And the really magical thing out of that, if Sir Robert Menzies didn't do that, we wouldn't have had a Senator Neville Bonner, because he come from Queensland. He got his vote, and within 10 years, he was a member of the Liberal Party, and he convinced his fellow party members to put him up as a senator for the Queensland.
Oh, the story of Neville Bonner is just extraordinary. The amount of challenges and deprivation he was able to overcome, and his resilience in the face of some pretty terrible racism, let's be honest, was astounding. It's, especially as a young boy, the stories he told of being so poorly treated when he went to school. It's an incredible story. And we had Sean Jacobs, who's just written a monograph on Neville Bonner. He joined the Afternoon Light podcast a little while ago, and we had a wonderful chat about Neville Bonner. But I wanted to ask you about the 67 referendum. Obviously, in 1967, it was the year after Menzies retired. He retired in January 1966. But referendums don't happen in a vacuum, do they, Warren? There is legislation that needs to be passed by the federal parliament in order to hold a referendum. And in April 1965, when Menzies was still Prime Minister, he did announce the government's intention to hold the referendum on the nexus in Section 127. Section 127 said, and it's just incredible to read these words in 2021 and reflect on the fact that they were in the Constitution at one stage, well, until 1967. It said, in reckoning the numbers of the people of the Commonwealth or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives should not be counted. I mean, it's no wonder that 90.7% of Australians voted yes to remove that section. They also voted yes to remove Section 5126, which was a section that didn't allow for the Commonwealth to pass laws in relation to Aboriginal people. And the amount of people who supported the 1967 referendum was the highest ever recorded in a federal referendum. So this was overwhelming. But tell me, Warren, how important was the 1967 referendum? It was important beyond the change to the Constitution, wasn't it?
It was an amazing change across Australia, and it got through, black, white, pink, green, didn't know who they were. The Australian public got really behind us. Sir Robert Menzies knew that we could not go on as a nation without not only changing sections of the Australian Constitution, but we had to move forward as a nation. And as you said, it wasn't 67 after his retirement, but to set up any constitutional change, it has to have a lot of debate, a lot of discussion and argument about it, and what is it going to look like, and then it has to get the support of all sides in Parliament, really, if you're going to get it to change, and then to put those arguments up, to design it and put it to the Australian public. And it's a long process. It just doesn't happen in 5 minutes. So Robert Menzies really seen the Australian public and wanted to take this leadership in this area and move forward as a nation. Now, some people talk about us being a racist nation and being terrible. Look, I don't know any nation in the world has had a very good birth. You know, you see revolutions, you see wars, you see a whole lot of things happening. But what I judge is on a nation is how they overcome that birth and how they build their nation forward. And the important thing for us, and this is what Menzies and the coalition recognise, is the institutions we have in Australia. So if you have a problem or an issue and it needs to be fixed, we have institutions that can make those changes. The Westminster Parliament, separation of the judiciary and the legislator and the executives. We have these great institutions that make a difference. And even when we make some mistakes, you know, even the judges realise you can make a mistake, so they have an appeals court. We have those type of things, so mistakes can be corrected. And it's the same with the legislator, you know. We have laws and then we can see how those laws operate. So that was our blessing that we got when we had the foundation of this nation in 1901, was those very strong institutions. And Sir Robert Menzies was a lawyer, of course, and he knew how those institutions could be operated to do good.
And he was incredibly committed to the notion of equality of all individuals, men, women, black, white, whatever in between. He held that up as essential for a liberal state, which was his aspiration for Australia. As part of his cabinet, he had Paul Hasluck, who was a Liberal MP, and he was Menzies' Minister for Territories. Paul Hasluck was someone who devoted his life to Indigenous affairs. He had a Master's in Aboriginal Affairs Policy, which he got in 1940, and the work was published in 1942 as Black Australians. He was the real architect of changing Australian policies from being race-based and focused on protective segregation to assimilation. Now, assimilation has got a bad rap these days. It was gradually abandoned in the 1970s, but in the 1950s under Paul Hasluck and of course under Robert Menzies' leadership, there was a real focus on the drive to equality for Indigenous Australians, wasn't there, Warren? And particularly because the Commonwealth Government didn't have power up until 1967 over making legislation in relation to Aboriginal Australians, Paul Hasluck, as Minister for the Territories, was able to make legislation and policies that related to Indigenous Australians in the Territory, at least. And so that was held up in his aspiration, at least, as setting an example for other parts of Australia and how to treat Indigenous Australians equally with their white brothers and sisters. But Warren, as an Aboriginal man, how do you look upon the program of reform of Paul Hasluck under Menzies that he carried out in the Northern Territory? Nothing is perfect, and obviously there's a context of the time, prejudices of the time that we would reject these days, but it certainly was a major step forward from the segregationist policies prior to 1950.
Well, it was, and it took the both of them working together. So Paul Hasluck, in my mind, he is a hero of Australia. He is a great man and a visionary about what Australia could become and how good Australia was. And he, like Sir Robert Menzies, he knew that we had to change and build a better nation for us. As you said, everything's not perfect when you're dealing with human beings. Human beings are not perfect, so things are not perfect. But what they did was build an enormous foundation for things to happen. As you're correct, Indigenous affairs, or Native affairs as they called it in those days, was under the control of the states. The states were that. The Commonwealth Government only had powers in the Northern Territory because they were the administrators of the Northern Territory. And Paul Hasluck knew that if we were going to really have bringing people together and giving equality and rights to people, then they had to have that 67 referendum to do that. So what Sir Paul Hasluck and Sir Robert Menzies did was build the foundations and build the institutions that could make those changes. So getting that constitutional change, simple as it may be, just a couple of sentences really have changed. I was a beneficiary of the education. They really went to getting, because as a child in the 60s, that they changed the education systems and working with states and territories in these areas about bringing Aboriginals into the mainstream system and getting full opportunities that those education systems would build a career and a life for us. And that's what it did for me. It's really fun. And how they put money and spent money in that space because they could now, because they had that constitutional change, and get the states to do these things. And it's quite marvellous to some of the incredible people that come out from that and had the benefit of that. So that they did that. They did a whole lot of other things in regard to discriminatory laws and working with the states to get them changed. Sir Paul Hasluck went on this, Harold Holt, and they're the ones who finally got the referendum up. And then you talk and you see all the different amazing changes for my life, for a whole lot of Indigenous people in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about institutions, one that I don't think people also associate particularly with Menzies, which they should, is the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, which is now known as the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. That was established in 1964, but it was established in the aftermath of a conference which has just celebrated its 60th anniversary. And the conference was set up really under the auspices of cabinet decisions in 1961. It was a conference on Australian Aboriginal studies, really looking at how Australia could go about preserving Aboriginal culture, and this was a decision of the Menzies cabinet. And the academic there was Emeritus Professor W.E.H. Stanner, who was a leading figure. I mean, he was a white man. He was a leading figure in Aboriginal studies, but that was part of the Menzies government legacy and institution building towards equality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And that was 1961, and then the Institute established in 1964. It lives to this day. It's an important centre to preserve the learning of Aboriginal culture and cultural identity and languages. But I don't think people recognise that was also part of the efforts that the Menzies government made and his ministers towards really elevating the status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia.
It brought it into the mainstream because up until that period, Aboriginals and Indigenous people, Torres Strait Islanders, were on the fringe of society, and no one really knew much about them. They were these people who lived on the fringe. They lived in Aboriginal reserves. They worked on cattle stations and stuff like that in a rural community now. But they were sort of out of sight, really. And no one knew very much about the culture. So by setting up IATSIS, as it is known today, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, it's brought Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and studies into universities and into the education system, where people could learn about Aboriginal culture, people could study it, Aboriginal people, and then you see that all the people who have become lost, through certain laws, welfare laws and so on, they're able to find their history, their families. Have that relationship, and then you see the enormous coming out of, course, the reinvigoration of Aboriginal art, and how that has become a global industry. Really, I've been a lawyer offices in New York and London, and you see these amazing Indigenous art hanging on their walls, Australian art, and it brought Aboriginal culture into the mainstream, and it made it part of our society. Now, what a visionary thing to do, and we're the beneficiaries of that as well. Here we are, 50 years later and 60 years, and we got this incredible institution. We've got these incredible people who are turning out a number of really great researchers and academics and so on, and educating people. It has an incredible, powerful thing, getting people to vote, getting them able to stand for Parliament or to stand for the local council. I was a deputy mayor in Dubbo for a number of years. And so getting those things to happen and getting people to have their voice, that just gave people a voice to be played part of the Australian community as well. They gave them a voice into that area.
Yeah, quite a phenomenal legacy of not just legislative but institution building. In the Robert Menzies Institute, its home is at Melbourne Uni, and Melbourne Uni is the custodian of Sir Robert's personal library, and it's about 4,000 books and papers. And actually, one of the papers in that collection is the book of conference papers delivered at the 1961 Conference on Australian Aboriginal Studies, and it lives in the Baillieu Library at Melbourne University to this day. So we certainly look forward to having that book on display in our exhibition space when we open that in February, because it is a tangible legacy of the efforts to establish IATSIS and of course really bring into the mainstream, as you said, Warren, Aboriginal culture and identity and art and language. And of course, it's such an international success. I wanted to talk to you, Warren, about native title and Menzies. Now, native title obviously was something that the High Court determined much later in the 1990s. But in August 1963, Menzies is still Prime Minister, still has 3 years to go. Menzies' government decided to release a parcel of land in the Arnhem Land Reserve in the Northern Territory to a foreign-owned mining company. They did this without consulting the Yolngu people who lived there, and the Yolngu people then proceeded to submit to Federal Parliament, to the House of Representatives, bark petitions, which became known as the Yirrkala bark petitions, and they are considered the first formal assertion of native title. Now, in response to this, Menzies actually set up a select committee to inquire into the concerns of the Yolngu people, and the committee recommended the protection of the sacred sites and the award of compensation for the lost land and livelihood to the local people. And this was a real landmark achievement for Aboriginal people in the passage towards native title. Again, I don't think particularly well acknowledged in sort of Australia's, cultural history and political storytelling and our myth making. But this was a first stage in 1963 during the Menzies government, and Menzies allowed that select committee to be formed to inquire into the issues, and happily for the Yolngu people, they did receive native title in the end under the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act 1976. But unfortunately for them, the mine was excluded from that grant. But tell me, Warren, how do we reconcile some of the myth-making in Australia when it comes to native title and the Menzies government?
And you see Gough Whitlam when he's pouring the sand into Vincent Lingari's hand, and that's an iconic photo. They don't prior to that, because it was the Liberal government under Billy McMahon who started those negotiations for that with Lord Vestey about the handover of that land, and they had actually completed those negotiations, but then the 72 election, I should say, happened in the course of the change of government, and so he was able, Gough was able to take all the credit. And in regard to the native title stuff, we look at, and Menzies was very smart about this, about constitutional law and that. Native title was everyone thinks it's Aboriginal law. In actual fact, it's not. It's about rights under English common law, which with the Lockean theories that created our institutions in Australia through colonisation, then of course the creation of the Commonwealth Government in 1901. When you look at the Blackburn case and the Mabo cases, which got that native title through, they were all based on that, going back through that steps back to those 60s, but also going right back into English common law about who owns land. These institutions that we have been able to give us that. You look at the land rights legislation that was passed in 1976 by the Fraser government. That was, again, it was the Westminster system of government that was able to negotiate that and get that through, that legislation through. And this is a gradual change, and the gradual changes happen because of those foundations and those structures that were built there. And that made it possible for the things we are doing today and how we're moving forward today as a nation. And we need to talk about those people. We need to talk about, Sir Paul Hasluck, an amazing book. See, you caught me on the hop here. I didn't know about that 1940s when he did stay. How amazing is that?
Yeah, no, there's I think a lot that we can uncover. I think you picked up on something that's really important about Menzies and policy reform and in Australia and how he conducted his governments cumulatively over 18 years, but particularly from 49 to 66, that 16-year period. He was an incrementalist. He didn't announce a policy, dramatic policy change on Australia without building support and preparing the policy and political territory for the change. And he did do things slowly, and that's a criticism levelled against him. But it's also, I think, a way of understanding his success, that he didn't force through change before society was ready for it. He led. He wasn't a follower at all. No one would say that of Menzies. And, of course, was a perfect practitioner in the art of persuasion. But I wanted to pick up, Warren, on why it is that people like yourself and Neville Bonner are attracted to that Menzies liberalism. What was it about Menzies and his political philosophy that attracted Indigenous politicians? Neville Bonner's story is amazing. He was an incredible example of self-belief, of hard work, of complete and utter resilience. And he also rejected the presumption that he would be of the left or a representative of the left. He really admired Robert Menzies. He wasn't an MP in the Menzies years. He entered the Parliament in the 1970s after Menzies had retired. But he definitely saw himself as a child of Menzies politically, didn't he?
We live in a country that is one of the greatest countries in the history of humanity. This Western democracy, Western liberalism, has given people longer lives, more prosperity, economic growth, the rule of law. They have to. You just can't be dragged off by like some South American dictatorship. You have to go and you have these rights. You have freedoms of speech. You have these freedoms that you enjoy here. And my father was very similar in a lot of ways. That he believed, you had to work. Very simple guy, had to work, had to feed your family, had to get a roof over their head. They had to have a better life than you. So making sure they're getting educated. They were very strong about education, making things happen for people. And so I was brought up with the same background. And that's why, when I was in the Labor Party, I was on right wing of the Labor Party. It's one of the reasons I left it was because I like the Hawke-Keating period because of that reform agenda, and this is what Menzies was. They weren't about destroying the structures or the fabric, which you hear on the streets today. We need to pull this all down, this colonial stuff, and destroy it. So this is the thing that really got me. It's about how do you build those environments using the structures that we have, which is so good that you're able to do that. In other countries in the world, you've got to have a revolution to make a change. You've got to tear the whole structures down. You've got to burn everything. Here in Australia, we have a very, very powerful weapon. Our powerful weapon is a pencil and a bit of paper, which you go into a little cardboard box and you pick your leader. You pick who's going to be the leader of the country or the leader of the state. That is so simple. While in other countries, they've got to have guns and they've got to have tanks and they've got to have things to make those changes. And we keep using those things because in the history of the world, I've studied history, thousands of years, we've got the best society in the world today. Is it a perfect society? No, there's no such thing as a perfect society. When you're dealing with human beings, we do some silly things sometimes. But it's been able to create an incredible culture here about,
Yeah, and it's you're so right about Australia being able to reform and evolve within the existing structures of its institutions without revolution. That's actually quite unusual when you look at the sort of global picture. Warren, you talk very much in terms of a Burkean conservative. You believe in strong institutions and I can understand you see yourself as very much a fellow traveller with Menzies in that respect. I wondered if we could finish off our discussion today on Afternoon Light talking about the current push for constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians and particularly the idea of the voice to Parliament that came out of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And, of course, there's a treaty involved in that proposal. How do you think Menzies, and this is hypothetical, we don't know. Menzies passed away in 1978. He retired as Prime Minister in 1966. Things have changed. But how do you think Menzies would view the voice to Parliament as proposed by the Uluru Statement?
You're right. We don't know what he thought, but it was a different period, a different time. I look around the world and where you have a race-based, in which Menzies wanted to, and Sir Paul Hasluck and Harold Holt wanted to remove from our constitution because we went through that. We went through that for 100 years, from 150 years of colonisation to that period. We wanted to move from race-based. We wanted the people, to have a say. Everyone has a say in it. So you look at the people, Aboriginals are sitting in record numbers in the Commonwealth Parliament, and there's more to come. And and in the state parliaments around Australia, and even in the local government areas, we have never had a better time for representation of people.
Is that right? On a per capita basis, is the level of Indigenous representation in the federal parliament the highest now?
It's the highest it's ever been. You've got of course, Ken White, who's cabinet. So these are things that Menzies and Sir Paul Hasluck. Now, this is a fantastic. We had the first Indigenous person in Parliament, or any Parliament. The Commonwealth Parliament was Neville Bonner. You had the first Indigenous person in the Queensland Parliament, and that was Eric Durrell. Now, he was of the Country Party, and Neville Bonner was the Liberal Party. You look at Hyacinth in the Northern Territory, the first Aboriginal in the Legislative Assembly in the Northern Country Liberal Party member. You look at all these incredible people around the country, and they're the legacies of that simple 1962 and 67 discussion. Give them the vote, take race out of the Constitution. I'm worried. I see governments around Australia, around the world, I should say, that do have race within. We saw in Fiji, they've taken race out of their constitution now. They had about 4 or 5 coups. You know, we have had amazing, peaceful transition of our nation through these institutions that we have. I see that having that voice to Parliament will weaken our major institution, which is the Constitution and the Commonwealth Parliament.
Well, thank you very much, Warren, for such a enlightening discussion on the Menzies legacy to Indigenous affairs, something that I think we've got to continue to have. I think there's your book to be written, which I look forward to, but also at the Robert Menzies Institute, we will be looking at these issues in much more detail, because I think there is a lot we can learn, the good, the bad, and all that is in between from what was done in the Menzies era, and how we can look to the future too, to ensure that reconciliation and closing the gap are all things that we can support, whether it's through constitutional recognition or not, whether it's preserving our institutions, upholding the Menzies aspiration of equality of all individuals in Australia should surely be the aspiration of us all. So thank you very much, Warren Mundine, for joining me on Afternoon Light.
That's great. I'll just finish off by saying that they'll probably make turnover in their grave, but St Paul has, like in St Robert Menzies, were revolutionaries, but they did it the right way. They took people in a democracy, they took people with them, they took the parliaments with them, and they built very strong institutions and paid respect to those institutions to make the legacies we have today.
Very well put. Thank you, Warren. The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.